Welcome to our Agile webinar on exam results. I'm Samra Sadeghi, Director of Trust Governance here at CST. And today I'm so pleased to be joined by Duncan Baldwin, a consultant at CST. He's our resident data guru, and Steve Rowlett, our Deputy CEO, who knows all about accountability and inspections, and he'll be speaking to that later. Duncan's going to give us the benefit of his wisdom around the results and the policy context and trends that we saw this year, and how to make sure you're getting the best insights out of your trust's results. But before I hand over to Duncan, I wanted to ask you to reflect on a few thoughts based on the principles in the Academy Trust Governance Code about being ethical leaders. First, as boards, this is one of the danger points for you when you can get so bogged down in the data that you lose sight of the bigger picture and you stop being strategic. When you're going over results with your exec team, you want to be seeking assurance from them that they understand the results and they have the expertise and capacity to address any issues, rather than you digging into the operational details yourselves. And if you have an education standards committee, you're going to want to let them to do the heavy lifting for you and allow room at the main board meeting to actually have those more strategic and long-term discussions. And depending on the size of your trust, that discussion is going to be different and possibly more granular at smaller trusts. But again, so important to remain strategic. Second, it's really your role as boards to set a positive culture in your trusts. We would encourage you to think about how that's going to manifest itself when you review your results with your exec team. Academic achievement is certainly a central part of your charitable object to advance education for public benefit, but it's only one part. This is an opportunity for organizational learning rather than just like internal accountability. Third, one of the main benefits of the Academy Trust system is that we can collaborate and learn from one another and continue getting better. Encourage your exec to connect with other trusts. It can be through our platforms, and either share your practice or learn from them, because when we're talking about benchmarking later, regional benchmarking is a perfect example of how you can find trusts in the same area with the same demographic and the same cohort, similar cohorts anyway, and compare the results and collaborate with them and share what works. Fourth, and really importantly, we know that well-being of staff is quite low at the moment. Last year's Teacher Wellbeing Index indicated that 89% of senior leaders are reporting feeling stressed, and that rises to 95% amongst head teachers. So it's our responsibility to start countering that culture of high stakes accountability. And if you've read that wonderful book, Tyranny of Metrics by Jerry Muller, he beautifully describes how becoming obsessed with metrics can really warp behavior and become counterproductive in the long term. And there's a huge amount of complexity that Duncan will tell you about that sits behind these results, both from the external environment, but around individual children. So it's really important not to rush to judgment. A positive culture starts with openness and transparency, and by creating a climate of psychological safety. I often describe that thermocline of truth, where the phenomenon where leadership often don't receive the information they need to make good decisions because there's a lack of psychological safety in the organization, and people on the front lines are not willing to be open, frank, and honest about what they're seeing. Openness and transparency also extends to your stakeholders. You want to think about how you communicate openly with them about your results. And finally, one of the key messages we're going to ask you to think about is how you celebrate and promote success at every level, being inclusive. It's great to celebrate your high achievers, but let's also encourage our schools and trusts to celebrate those who made progress against great odds. And what happens to those young people who leave with nothing? Does your trust have a plan for them? In speaking to Duncan, I know this really weighs on him heavily, doesn't it, Duncan? Nod your head. There are too many children that are still leaving our schools without any qualifications at all. And we have a moral imperative to consider how we are providing an education for each and every child and giving them the best possible deal. So that's enough from me. I'm going to hand over to Duncan to tell you about results.
That's great. Thank you very much, Sam. Good evening, everybody. This is the second of two presentations that we've been delivering to colleagues, CST colleagues. So the more operational data folk were in a session just before this. So it's my pleasure to be talking this through with you. We're going to be looking at what we know about the results that we've got from this summer, and also what we don't know, crucially as well. And then some a number of observations, and I think then we're going to then sort of have more chat, aren't we, Sam? Some discussions, and everybody colleagues will join in. Sam's in the driving seat on the progressing the slides here. So before we get into the gory details, let's have a slight history lesson. Actually, this was taken from a period in the Second World War where the US military, Army and Navy were really concerned about the number of Army and Air Force were really concerned about the number of aircraft that were being shot down and lost. But the huge costs to all of that in sort of monetary terms and human life and so on. So what they did was they researched and analysed aircraft when they returned and mapped out where the aircraft were most damaged. And this chart here is a sort of representation of the sort of information that they had. And you can see where the sort of the bullet holes, I guess, were most frequent. And so it's obvious then what you do, isn't it, in terms of reinforcing your aircraft. What you do is you see where the bullet holes are and put some more armor on there, or at least that was what was obvious to the military. And it took the mathematician, statistician Abraham Weld, who was working at Columbia and was involved in this project, to say, actually, no, this is not what we want to do. We don't want to reinforce where the bullet holes are. We actually want to reinforce where the bullet holes are not, because the aircraft that were returning were the ones that survived being shot. The ones that didn't return were the ones that were the problem. And so presumably the ones that were shot in those zones, the nose and the rear of the fuselage, the engines and so on, were the ones where there was more damage. And so the point about that, and I am stretching the point a little bit for the purpose of this session, but it's a slight warning note really that where we are in this, where we are in the academic calendar, if you like, this point of term is still very early, obviously. We're in a place where we do not have all the information. We don't have the missing aircraft to analyse yet, if you like. We've only got the ones that have come back, as it were. So for all this, we need to be very cautious in any inferences we make, any decisions that we make, and so on, because at this point in the calendar, we don't have all the information. So history lesson over. I think that's quite a fascinating example. Remind me at the end, Sam, to tell you something rather poignant about that story. Actually, okay. It's quite sad, really, but I'll forget otherwise.
All right.
Okay, you've got the button to move on, I think. Okay, so let's just start by looking at some things that we do know for sure, and these are policy issues that have sort of been pre-announced, if you like, policy decisions and so on. I mean, we're at an interesting time in education policy because these decisions I'm going to go through now were made under the auspices of the previous government. And you've seen just this week, actually, the new government just sort of starting to flex its education policy muscles, if you like. So you'll have heard the announcements about Ofsted and no single phrase judgments, which have emerged this week. And if you work in education policy, that's the sort of the most fascinating time, really, finding out where new governments are going to priorities and what they're going to do. But until more of that emerges, what we're in is a sort of a bit of a policy vacuum, and we're looking back to what the previous government had decided. So let's just make sure we understand that and can see how it influences what results are looking like this year. So the first point there is that there's a return to so-called pre-pandemic grading across the UK. And you might say, well, hold on a minute, I thought we'd already done that. I thought we did that last year. And you would be right, or at least you'd be right in England, is the point about this. Education's a devolved matter, so there are separate policy decisions in Wales and Northern Ireland and Scotland, but it's Northern Ireland and Wales that are most pertinent here because they have similar qualifications. And the education, the decisions made by the relevant bodies there was that returning to, normal, in inverted commas, was going to be different. The way that they were going to do it in Wales and Northern Ireland was different, which meant that grades in Wales, and this is a particular frustration if you happen to have schools, along the English Welsh border where students can move from one side to the other, if you like, meant that sort of grades were out of kilter last year. And so this year that's less so. They're still not quite the same. They've never actually been exactly the same. So A levels are slightly different, I think, in Wales compared to England, but they're broadly similar at least. So we're back now to, well, there are no sort of further plans, if you like, for sort of COVID recovery, if you want to put it that way. And the next point there was a policy decision that was taken pre-COVID, but has taken some years to implement. This is the exams regulator Ofqual taking a decision to adjust grading in French and German to be in line with Spanish. It's a long-running problem, is this? In fact, it extends back not just years, but decades. Even to the point when I did O-level German, and actually knowing about this makes me feel a lot better about my German O-level grade, frankly. But there's been a problem in grades in French and German compared to other subjects, and it's come more sharply into focus when we've had, the sort of the new performance measures, attainment 8 and EBAC and whatnot. Because the grading is harsher, or has been historically harsher in French and German compared to other subjects that young people might choose, like history, GCSE, or geography, for example. To the extent that there's a measurable difference in grades nationally, with all sorts of negative connotations about French and German, and with young people thinking that they're not as good in French or German or Spanish or whatever. Anyway, the decision was made pre-COVID. Obviously, the COVID years made it difficult to sort of track that through. But Ofqual have said recently that this year awarding in French and German will be more generous in line with Spanish. That's good. The only problem is that the awarding in Spanish is also out of kilter with history and geography. Spanish is itself severely graded, so there is still work to do there. But any progress on that is welcome, but still more to do. They also took a view that computing GCSE was harshly graded, and we'll be able to see the impact of that decision in some of the things I'm going to share with you a little bit later. So that was a decision that's being implemented, and implemented even more, if you like, this year. Next point is that there are some new qualifications, some new vocational technical qualifications. And just a point here, people often call these things BTECs as a shorthand. That's a bit like saying Hoover instead of vacuum cleaner, really, because there are other vocational qualifications that are produced by some of the other rewarding organisations. So the right vocabulary really is to say vocational technical qualifications, in order to avoid upsetting some of the other providers. Anyway, there are two new, there are some new qualifications, some tech awards this year, with the ramifications being that changes whether you can look at results over time for those qualifications. I'll come back to that. The next one is about performance tables, and this is, if you like, Nick Gibbs' last stand, I suppose, if you want to think about it that way. Decision made by Nick Gibb relatively recently that in performance tables, the percentage of children in a school taking modern language qualification and also taking the separate science qualifications will be elevated in performance tables, so it was much more visible. The point being that parents presumably would then be able to see that more readily. They've always measured those things, but they haven't had such a high profile. So when you look at performance tables when they come out, you'll see that much more visibly. The next point is about universal credit. Universal credit's been around for some years now. It's been sort of rolling out over time. The impact that it has on what we're talking about here today is that universal credit is the trigger, isn't it, for free school meals and other benefits, but it's the sort of the arbiter of poverty, if you like. And so anything that we look at in the context of free school meals and attainment points back to universal credit. Because universal credit has been rolling out over time, has been rolling out sort of regionally, and because there's been some protection to recipients of benefits like this, it's meant that the population that we have had, that we've traditionally looked at, the sort of disadvantaged population, has changed in nature over time. And in particular, there's a larger percentage of that population is sort of higher prior attainment. So this has a bearing when you're looking, or will look at, in the future at the gap, if you like. Bear in mind that the population itself hasn't necessarily been stable. The population's been changing over time. So be aware of that. The next one is level 3 value added measures. So if you have sixth form settings in any of the academies in your trusts, this is the progress measure that we've had, but we haven't had for the last couple of years because you need both sort of GCSE exams and A level and VTQ qualifications in order to do that. The earliest possible year for this measure to return is this year, but I think, as I'll explain in a little while, whether it will return is actually tricky because of some of the ways that, well, because of where those are the current crop of A-level students that just finished, because of the GCSEs that they took were differently graded. So I think ministers and officials are working through to see whether they can publish that. They would want to publish them if they could, but they'll need to make sure they're sort of safe and meaningful, if you like. And the last point there is that Progress 8, which, as you know, is the de facto headline measure for secondary schools, will not be published for the next 2 years. So we've got the return of one value-added measure and the departure, or at least the pause of the main one that's used for secondary schools. Whether it will come back, we don't know. Whether it will come back in a different form, we don't know. Possibly the current government might quite welcome the fact that they can't publish it a couple of years, because it'll give them a bit of time to sort of work through what it is they want to do and whatever changes they might make.
Duncan, really quickly, can you explain why there'll be no Progress 8 measure?
Yeah, it's to do, well, so progress measures, I can't explain it very quickly. I'll try.
Okay.
Progress measures require 2 sets of variables, really. So Progress 8 is measured at the starting point. Actually, can you ask me that question again when we come back to the graph? It'll be easier to see a picture. It's always easier to see a picture to explain that.
All right, brilliant.
You remember to ask me a little later on. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so let's now sort of drill in a little bit into a bit more specific. We're going to sort of look in a bit more detail A levels and level 3 vocational technical qualifications. So the mantra, anyway. So if you listen to the exams regulator, awarding organisations, and all that lot, you'll see, yes, everything's back to normal, pre-pandemic, etc., etc. I'm going to sort of question that. I'll show you why I think that's not quite right, and I think it's also a little bit like that aeroplane. I think we're missing crucial information here to make that statement, actually. But the headlines, the newspapers will report everything is back to normal, everything's fine, COVID's gone, etc. We've got more A-level candidates this year, so the total entry is up by 1.9%. But although the number of 18-year-olds, the actual cohort, the population has also gone up. That's only gone up by 0.9%. So we've got a bigger if you like, chunk of the population doing A levels than we've had before. And I think we'll possibly, that will, is that a good thing? Is it a bad thing? I think it will raise some questions which you can answer in your own mind when I show you the data in a moment. But it's certainly a slightly different population, this one that's just gone as an A-level population. That has meant that sort of the magic number for A-level maths for national entries has exceeded 100,000. So A-level maths is easily the largest, most popular A-level subject. We've had for the first time 100,000 maths A-level entries. We've also seen increases in physics, further maths, computing. Obviously, that sort of, I was, figured out by now that I used to be a maths teacher. So this is all great. This is all great for me. I think this is all fantastic. But other people worry about, when I worry too about humanities and English and whatnot. But there we are. That is what's happened, and can't deny that more physics, more physicists isn't a good thing, really. Definitely need more physicists. Meanwhile, there are students going for vocational technical qualifications, not just BTECs, but BTECs is a big provider in that space. The most popular areas that students choose to follow courses there are business, administration, law. That's sort of one broad area, social sciences, and then health, public services, and care. So lots of students take those qualifications. You may know that there is discussion about the sort of longevity of those questions, particularly in line with T levels, which is the last point there on that slide, which is a relatively new type of qualification. Some new T levels were awarded for this year for the first time. 7,000 students now got T level qualifications this year, which is great. Challenging, broad, big qualification, lots to get right there, but still a very small number compared to you can see the numbers there. So 7,000 across all T levels, for example, whereas 32,000 taking those VTQs. They're not the same type of qualification or the same size by any means, but you've got some indication there of the numbers involved. Thank you. So the next thing to do, this is still largely focusing on A level, the level 3, well, not state level, level 3 students, is whether and why normality, at least in my view, hasn't quite been restored. The way to look at this table is to look over on the right-hand side and think about the A-level cohorts. Okay, so back in 2018, A-levels were normal, and as far as that cohort was concerned, the GCSEs that they'd taken 2 years before that in 2016 were also normal. Nothing was changing, nothing in flux. We had A star to G back in the day there. It was the first year of Progress 8, but that didn't affect students. It was a performance measure. So 2018 was, if you like, a normal year, if there are any normal years. The year after that, in 2019, A levels were normal, but in 2019, but in 2017, that was when GCSE grading was introduced, when it was reformed. So English and maths were the first to change to the 9-to-1 grading. We had A star to G for the remaining GCSEs. So that was a sort of a non-normal input year. And Sam's prompting to me about value added and all of that. For these types of measures, you need stable input and stable output. And the point is, it's GCSE that's input and A level that's output. And we can sort of read through that table. You'll remember centre assessed grades in 2020 for A level students. So they didn't have any exams at all then, or indeed in 2021. The centre assessed grades and the teacher assessed grades resulted in overall grades going up, and the regulator and government decided that the right move for England was to bring those back down in 2 steps. And so in 2022, awarding was halfway back, halfway between normal and its inflated position after the two COVID affected years. And 2023 back to normal. So as I said, we thought we were normal last year, right? But if you look at the last two, the left-hand columns there, last year's cohort had teacher assessed grades. They didn't take exams at GCSE. And crucially, the 2022 cohort that fed into the 2024 A-level cohort, they had their grading was halfway between, inflated COVID, if you like, and normal. So the grades that students got in 2022 at GCSE were on the whole higher than they would be the following year in 2023, and indeed they are now. Which means that children have had more cards to play, if you like. I think. So in terms of entry onto A-level courses, if you set whatever your admissions policy in A-level courses was, children on the whole, students had more chance of getting those grades because of the way that grades were awarded. And I think that's played into some of what we may see in terms of the results now. So I'll sort of explain through to you. But just to finish off, so 2025, in fact, will, as far as A-level students is concerned anyway, will be the first normal, properly normal year that will have happened since 2018 because of all of these, policy changes, assessment changes, COVID and COVID recovery, which is quite surprising. So I don't really think you can talk about 2024 as normal from that point of view. Right. Well, okay. So this will make some of you weep, but don't. Try not to. We're going to look at what this table tells us, and this is from data that was published by Ofqual relatively recently as part of their output for A-level results. I'm going to sort of talk you through it because we'll have a similar table for GCSE results. So understanding how this table works is important. It'll highlight some of the issues that I've already flagged up with you. So I've chosen at random, well, as you can see, more or less alphabetically, actually. I sort of picked an A, B, C, D, and an E, and then I had to have maths because I was going to tell you something about maths specifically, but there's no other reason than that. So let's look at the art and design part of the table. If you just focus your attention on that. Art and design actually isn't a single A-level, it's a sort of conglomeration of different types of A-level subjects, but that's not really the issue. Don't worry too much about that. But what this table is telling us, it's giving us information pointing back to 2019, which was the last normal year, if you like. Not even 2022, of course, because of the halfway stage. 2023 was normal-ish in 2024. So we can begin to see from this table how many students took those qualifications. So you can see art and design A-level is in the sort of around the 40,000 mark. Now these numbers over on the right are cumulative percentages of grades, and this is the best way to look at grading. I don't want to sort of get into a sort of a lesson on how to do this, but it's better to look at grades, not at the number or percentage of kids who get a particular grade, but to look at how that builds up from the A-star end of things. So this table means that if we take the very top row there, 13.9% of those students who entered art got an A-star in 2024. The 32 next to it tells us that 32% got an A or an A-star. So they got, if you like, at least a grade A. Okay, so these are cumulative numbers. The 63.6 tells us about students who got at least a grade B, so a B or an A or an A-star. That's the best way to present this information. So we've got that, and you see the further you get over to the right, 99.1% of candidates entering art and design got at least an E, which meant that some didn't pass, some students don't pass, and so you can work out, I think that's sort of 0.9%, isn't it? Get got a U grade for art and design. So that's how the table works, and you've got that for each of the years. I just wanted to reflect on some differences then, and to allow you, if you like, to sort of, cast your eye down this table to see really if things have returned to normal. Are we back where we were? So if you look at the sort of the A star and the A and A star in particular, and then just look at how things have sort of changed between 2019 and 2024, you'll see that mostly there's a bit of an upwards drift in the percentage of entries that are getting these top grades, aren't they? So in art, drifted up from 12 to 13. In drama, drifted up from 4.3 to 6, and so on. And maths drifted up a little bit from 16.3 to 16.7. And the percentage of children getting these top grades as a percentage of the entries is also quite different, isn't it? So don't get the idea, if you like, that the A levels are all awarded in the same way, because they're not. One would think they ought to be, but they aren't for a number of reasons. Now, if you watch the news, it's always the same, isn't it? Whenever results come out, all the media stories are all about grades going up, grades about A stars and A's and all of the rest of it, and the photographs of the youngsters jumping up with their results and whatnot. But I'd just like to look over at the other end, if you like, at the E's and the U's, because I think this is the story actually, not the A star and the A end. So some upward drift in A star and A. But let's have a look over at the E's and the U's. If you take drama in 2024, you got 99.5% of youngsters who entered drama got a grade out of it, right? So only 0.5%, if you like, studied drama for 2 years, did the exams and all of that stuff, and then haven't really got a grade. So 99.5. Have a look down at maths. In fact, have a look at the E and above figure for maths. So back in 2019, 96.8% of entries got an E grade. That number has gradually gone down, and only 96% of youngsters in maths A level. Thank you. That's very helpful mouse toggling. Sam, very skillful. Thank you. Well, and that means you're paying attention as well. That's very good. So well done. 96% of young people doing maths this year, actually. So that percentage getting a grade has drifted down, hasn't it? In the since 29, and even gone down a bit since 23. Now, you might say, well, 96%, that's pretty much all of them, isn't it? Nearly all of them. Well, just think about what that actually means. So I told you earlier, and you can see it there, that you've got just a little over 100,000 entries in maths. Now, if my own maths is right, and goodness knows it's a long time since I've been a maths teacher, that means 4% of those young people, in fact, didn't get a grade. So we've got actually 4,000 young people who studied maths for 2 years and got nothing out of it. Right now, I think that's a problem, a serious problem actually. And some of those young people will be from your trusts. That's a lot of kids, isn't it? That's a lot of kids who spent all of that time, all of that resource studying that qualification, and got nothing effectively, got a U grade as a result. So that sort of goes back to that point, I think, about 2 years before that, grades were slightly more relaxed. Maybe students ended up on A-level courses slightly easier, in a slightly easier way because of admissions policies. I don't know, I can't vouch for individual settings and their admissions policies, but it seems to me that we've got, by not properly taking that on board, possibly we've got some youngsters on the wrong course here, because I think 4,000 is a lot, a lot of youngsters to have nothing. And you see different rates for this, so as I said, 99.5% of drama students get an E. So it's a really, I know fewer drama students all told, but really, not so many. I think 4,000 is I'm personally quite shocked by that, actually.
Duncan,
I think, yeah. So as I say, I think that's the story, right? In terms of reflecting on your own results. If you've got A-level students in your setting, I'd want to know about that. Actually, we can celebrate the A stars and the A's by all means. That's all fabulous and so on. But I would really want to take a look at those students, Fenny, who didn't get. Sorry, Sam.
One point you'd made when we spoke earlier is that it's important to look at the difference in national grading when you're considering how much your grades have gone up within your trust.
Oh yeah, that's right. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in particular when we look at the GCSE schools. I've said already that we're going to look at that there was a policy decision for computing, right? For computing GCSE, we'll be able to see that in the data, and therefore we need to be careful when we're talking about, if you ask the obvious trustee question, how well have we done? You have to be careful to set that against any changes that are taking place in, the national picture. So if A stars have gone up in your settings by something or other, as you can see now from this data, actually A stars have gone up nationally. So the question isn't, well, or the observation shouldn't be, oh, it's great that our A stars have gone up. The observation should be, have A stars gone up in line with changes that we can see nationally, right? Sort of more of that in a minute, though. So I hope that wasn't too painful. But it's really important, I think, to look at this type of data to understand what's happened, in the whole country first of all, and then that sets the context for what you've got, what's going on in your own academies and whatnot.
Duncan, just conscious of time as well, just
Sure.
so we have
Okay.
enough time for Q&A.
We'll thank you for your discipline here. Okay. GCSE level 2, again, entries were up, 6.2 million entries. Other jurisdictions look on what happens in the UK. I'm familiar with people from policy people in Japan, for example. They look on in awe at what we managed to do, right? So you think about 6.2 million GCSEs taken, marked, graded, sent back, processed in the time available. It is a remarkable achievement. We should never shy away from that. Actually, it's an astonishing feat, and I don't think it happens at that sort of scale anywhere else, really. We've also shouldn't forget though that we've got a lot of youngsters at that age doing level 2 VTQs, and this is where you've got the new tech awards that have been introduced. So let me say about that when you have a new qualification, then you can't compare it because it's a different entity. So tech award in subject X will not be like tech award in subject X from the previous year. Different assessment regime, different spec, and so on. So do be careful, or do expect to see some awards that are new, and the leaders in your trust saying, or should be saying, really, that means we can't compare them to previous years. But that would be correct. Girls do better than boys at GCSE on the whole, but it varies a bit. So they wildly outperform boys in English, not so much in maths. But on the whole, the gap is a little bit lower this year. And some other subjects that have increased entries, so statistics becoming very popular. So thinking about what your academies do. GCSE statistics, good qualification, not that much statistics in the GCSE maths qualification. So I'd do that if that was me. Business studies as well. Music, which is great because entries were decreasing, had been for a while. But also entries in Spanish as well went up this year. Thank you, Sam. Let's move on. So it's time for another table, but you're now expert in tables like this, right? So you're already knowing where to look. I thought it'd be interesting to put the same subjects up. So it's got the same, or art and design again is a group of subjects. Obviously, we've got more grades here, so going from one to 9. What's slightly problematic about this table, though, is this is England, so it's a GCSEs in England, but unfortunately, they don't split it up for 16-year-olds in England. So this table also includes those poor souls who are retaking maths if they haven't got a grade 4, which means you've got to be careful with this number. You can tell that if you look at the number sat, that's sort of 800,000, something like that. Well, the cohort, of 16-year-olds, I think, is about 650,000. So you can see that there are, older students going back in for maths. And some of these subjects, of course, are, if you like, optional. So students typically choose drama or they choose computing. On the whole, they don't choose. Well, definitely don't choose maths. They don't really choose English literature. Most schools will now enter all their youngsters for English literature GCSE and so on. So you have got to be careful. But again, you can see some of these changes.
Sorry.
It's
Sorry,
right.
my bad.
You're getting carried away with the excitement of the but the last thing to just draw your attention to then, so I mentioned that policy change in computing. There we go. That's it. You're in the right place. Thank you. So you can see, even since last year, 5.2% of entries in 2023 got a grade 9, 8.5 this year. And if you read across, you can see the increase in, kids getting at least an 8, at least a 7, and at least a 6, and at least a 5, and so on. So you can see that policy decision in action there. So yeah, again, I repeat, it'd be great if you as a trustee hear, results in GCSE computing have gone up, don't just pause before you say that's great, fantastic, well done. The right question is, but have they gone up in line with the rest of the nation? So I suppose being very crass about it, if your grade 9s went up by 2%, you could say, well, that's not enough. It's because actually they've gone up by over 3%. You won't say that because you're humane, pleasant, and very reasonable trustees. I hope. I'm sure you are. You look nice to me. But you know what I mean. So this is why it's really important to take on board the national distribution of these grades. And yeah, I've got my eye on the time now. Right, back to the aircraft. So we know about the grades, right? Or at least we know about the entries. We know about the young people who have been entered for qualifications. What we have not got are some other crucial bits, which we'll come to as the fourth point here. But we don't have value-added scores for A-level qualifications and other level 3 qualifications, and we don't know quite if we will. The DfE haven't committed. They've said it's possible, but they haven't committed to doing it yet. But even if we do, they won't be normal because of what I explained yesterday. You may have been made aware of some Progress 8 scores because basically pretty much all schools now second guess the DfE by working with their providers, so that providers gather together results from schools directly, and you can sort of second guess or estimate Progress 8 scores. They're not official, but I can tell you from sort of first-hand experience they're usually pretty accurate at this point. But you shouldn't they're, if you like, to use recent vocabulary, they're a poll, but they are an exit poll, if you like. Right, so they're based on actual data, if you like, gathered from schools. For me, it's how subjects deliver in individual schools, academies, really that's important. Progress 8 is all right. It's if you've got to have these measures, you've got to have them. But Progress 8 doesn't really tell you the details, the nuts and bolts of what you really need to focus on in your academies. It doesn't, it can, because Progress 8 mixes up loads of different qualifications, it won't get to the heart, I think, of the issue here, which is, for me anyway, having been a trustee, how are kids doing in, I don't know, geography, let's say, you know, how are they doing? You know, are kids getting a reasonable deal in each of our academies in geography? And how do we know that? What do we look at? And if not, you know, how do we deploy our resources from our other academies and from our teams to improve that? But what we don't have, we specifically don't have, and you'll know by now that this does really concern me a lot. We don't have data on those young people who didn't enter any exams. You will have, I expect, heard more about young people who've just switched off, you know, who aren't attending, who sort of come in for exams maybe and don't engage with exams in ways that, you know, back in my day and Steve's day, probably when we were working in schools, you just wouldn't have that. That's a sort of a new sort of post-COVID phenomenon. So those numbers don't show up in what's been published. They do show up, well done, thank you, in output like this, which is where I always start. If I'm working with a school on a consultancy basis or that sort of thing, I ask to see this first. I've sort of put my hands over my ears before they tell me what their Progress 8 score was, because this is the picture of how students have attained. So on the vertical axis is attainment 8, so the sort of the total point score. But across the horizontal axis, we've got prior attainment at key stage 2, okay? And Progress 8, to answer Sam's question finally, is so each of those blue dots there is the score of a pupil, so representing a pupil score. Progress 8 is basically for a pupil how much above or below that average line they are, okay? And then really all you do is you add all of those differences up to get the school's Progress 8 score. But the issue is we're talking about now is the impact of attendance, which I think is really the most serious problem going on in schools. Because if you filter that graph out, for this particular school, those are the children who attended for less than 90% of the time. And you can see that, you know, but all bar a handful of those students, their attainment has been well below average. And I am sure you will have heard that, you know, you'll have heard heads of school or whatever, or on, you know, however it works in your trust, you know, saying that the impact on results is clear. You can see it clearly there, right? And the converse isn't true necessarily. You know, so it's not true that if they attend 100%, then they'll be above the line by any means. But in this particular school, and this is a line that you hear a lot from head teachers, if we take out the kids who didn't attend very well, then our Progress 8 would be X. Okay, that's slightly flawed because you'd have to do that for all schools really to get what the X score would be. But you can see the point here very clearly, you know. So that's really problematic.
So Duncan, one
Yeah.
point you made when we were discussing is that averages are not as helpful, and that
Yeah,
you need
that's right. Well, so Progress 8 is an average score.
Yeah.
You know, you might as a trustee or a governor have said, oh, our Progress 8 score is 0.1 or minus 0.3, which is, you know, it is what it is, right? It doesn't tell you what to do next. You know,
Yeah.
it doesn't show you in the way that pictures like this show you. For example, you know, those youngsters right down on the bottom, you see those? There's six or seven youngsters with a score of 0. Those are these youngsters that haven't engaged with the system. They've got 0 qualifications. They're on the school's books, if you like. They're on performance tables and so on, but they don't feature in the data that I've just showed you from, you know, Ofqual and JCQ from the exam boards necessarily. These are children who may not have been entered for any GCSEs, or may have been entered but then didn't actually engage with them at all. They've ended up with 0. The same or similar issue, I think, to the maths. You know, those 4,000 students who didn't get maths. What's happened with these students who are sort of down at that end of
So
things?
the first point is about averages not being helpful, needing to have more like this type of scatter plot graph, right? But there's a question in the chat that I think is a good one as well, which is the kind of how do you disentangle attendance issues from other characteristics like disadvantaged send and
Well,
EAL?
that's a good question. So, I mean, the process of looking at well, it's a filtering issue, isn't it? So, it is. I know for a fact it is possible on this particular application to filter out for the characteristics that the colleague in the chat has put on. So you could further filter that down to talk about EAL students. Actually, EAL students are likely to be further up,
That's right.
but we haven't got time to go
Oh,
into
yeah.
all those nuances really. But we have got a plan for how we can go into those nuances, right, Sam? So you'll come to that in a minute.
Yep.
So let's go back to our bullet holes then. So when will we get more information in order to get to make decisions, make better decisions? Well, the DfE publish sort of so-called unvalidated progress 8 scores quite early, late September, October time, approximately, along with all sorts of other collateral. And that will be the DfE's first stab at saying what sort of the official progress 8 scores are. And they publish those ostensibly to help parents make choices, so parents can see what those scores are early enough. Also about that time are the scores that relate to individual subjects. For me, as I've said, as a trustee, I was most interested in the subject level performance. And actually, the biggest problem we've got to fix in our schools isn't progress 8 and how our schools perform. The biggest problem in England is that within a school, we've got variable attainment. Schools are actually far more like each other and vary far more internally in England than they do in other jurisdictions. So I think the challenge is always to look at how what have children done in individual subjects, because that gets sort of obfuscated out by progress 8. And then, of course, performance tables properly published in January 2025, bearing in mind you'll have some new things about your academies published there, your MFL and your separate sciences as well. So that'll be visible to all.
Okay.
I think that's it, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think,
and before I stop presenting the slides, brilliant, Duncan, thank you so much. I just wanted to highlight some additional support that's available from us at CST, relevant courses that you can take. Steve will do his Leading Trust Schools through Ofsted inspections. Actually, we haven't talked about Ofsted, have we, Steve? Essential Trustee Program, Duncan presents at that one. And also we have an understanding and making use of school performance data. But Steve, can I come back to you about accountability and inspections? I'm going to stop sharing while you give us your thoughts.
Yeah, so quite often people wonder what all this means, particularly for Ofsted inspections. So just a few headlines for you. And next week, we're going to be holding a special member briefing where we're going to talk about all the recent Ofsted changes. I'm not going to touch on that stuff now. You've seen, hopefully, the briefings where we've covered that off in the last couple of days, some significant changes. As far as data is concerned, actually, a lot of the messages are the same as they've been for a little while with Ofsted, which is that Ofsted uses published data as a starting point on inspection. Inspectors have a copy of the inspection data summary report, which has key data about the school, and they'll use that to shape some of the questions they ask head teachers and so on. And of course, that process begins the moment the head teacher has that initial call. They will want to probe with the head teacher, really, what's the data telling you about your school, do you think? And then they'll carry some of those threads through in some of the conversations I'll have with department leaders, Senkos and all that sort of stuff. Key messages for you as trustees and governors is that they won't expect you to have memorized stats, or if you meet an inspector who does feel like they have to expect you to memorize data and stats, tell them that's not a fair expectation and get in touch with me if it's mid-inspection you're worried about it. But what they will expect, and I think this is probably reasonable, they will expect you to know the narrative broadly. So what are the things that this school is doing well and the things that this school isn't doing so well? What are the main messages emerging from that published data? And of course, the inspectors will be tallying all of this stuff the whole time with what they're seeing on the ground through all the other inspection work that they'll be doing. Some particular messages, if I've got just a minute, Sam. Inspectors will be cautious around data in 1 year. And again, if you have an inspector who's not being particularly cautious around the data in 1 year, we know, as Duncan's talked about, things can fluctuate and move around a little bit anyway. Inspectors should be wary of that, particularly in this post-pandemic context. And they should be particularly cautious in how they deal with value-added measures like Progress 8 or value-added measures at Key Stage 5. And again, if you're ever concerned about that, talk to us about it. Get perhaps your executive team to get in touch with us if you think there's an inspector that's not dealing with that in the right way. But those aren't new messages. Those are broadly where Ofsted's been for a little while.
Okay, that's really helpful. Duncan, thank you so much for your presentation. Steve, thanks for that. If anyone has questions they want to put in the chat, we've only really got a few minutes, but I did want to touch on destinations as well. I feel like we didn't talk about the fact that boards need to assure themselves about where pupils are going. If they've got NEET pupils, what's your plan for them? Thoughts on destinations? Agree, that's a big part of reviewing results, isn't it?
Well, I think so. So of the many things that are measured about schools, and along with the debate about what schools are for, whatever your view is all about that, surely getting young people into and onto the right next stage and sort of getting them equipped for that is so important. And that's why I'm concerned about these youngsters who seem to be falling off at the other end. What does that say potentially about advice that young people are getting, careers advice and so on. Destinations is sort of my favorite measure. I think it seems to be the thing, really, and particularly with SEND pupils, it really is the thing, to make sure that their futures are secured as well. So I'm sure you'll get. And the downside of it is, you'll receive information about destinations. So, how many of our students have got their choices and so on. But again, what does that look like compared to the nation? The frustrating thing about destinations is you have to wait several years for those students to sort of, make sure they fulfill their the next stage in order to get the data back. So, yeah.
I do want to flag for trustees that a careers link trustee has been added to the Academy Trust Governance Guide. So you now are recommended to have a safeguarding link trustee, send link trustee, and a careers one. And I think that careers one's really important for trustees to focus on, have someone really watching that and making sure that children are getting good advice around careers. Any other big gaps that we might want to fill? Any other questions from folks? And Steve's put in an extra bit about Ofsted. They won't look at your internal assessment data, but they will want to know how the school or trust is using it to support the school's work and pupil achievement. Fantastic, helpful. Okay, fab. I think we're at the end of it. Really thanking you, Duncan, for your wisdom, and Steve, and thank you all for coming. Really appreciate it.